Hello, everybody. I'm Margaret, and we're wrapping up our incredibly interesting week of readings and discussions about Tawhid, the divine unity of God. And welcome to my Latin classroom. I thought this was an interesting backdrop to have for you as I'm trying to wrap up the discussions we had about al-Ghazali's writings about the attributes of God. And I'm surrounded by a classroom filled with images of the Greco-Roman gods and the literature of the Greco-Roman gods that I teach every day to middle school students. And I wanted to choose this backdrop because the themes that I saw coming out were all talking about language and the language that we're using to talk about God and the Trinity, our triune God, and then our understanding that we saw in al-Ghazali's writings of how he describes the attributes of God. So I'll come back to this and these images you're seeing a little bit later, but first of all, I feel really fortunate to have had this first topic. It felt so grounding, so important, so comfortable in so many ways, and so beautiful to read the writing of al-Ghazali and to go, yeah, I get that. It feels good. And I know that most people gravitated towards the other readings and the discussion of Trinity because that was more difficult to wrap our heads around and more controversial, more polemic, I guess. But it felt really easy to read the readings of al-Ghazali and see so much that felt familiar and go, yes, that's our God. And, have the kind of feeling of we all worship the same God, but our God does not need to be described in the same ways, felt right in this reading. So first of all, I just wanted to say I apologize if I have to stop and start this video as I'm trying to get this done in between classes and students coming in. So it might do this in bits and spurts. So I was talking mostly in my recap of al-Ghazali about the way he was describing the attributes of God and dividing them into sort of, as I saw them, functional and ontological attributes describing things that God does, and the essence of God, and then comparing that to Rahman's writings that really felt the same but different, because I felt as if his focus was on more the functional and manifestations of God's mercy in all of the ways that he described God. But what I saw coming out in our discussions was these really interesting discussions about the language, started by Adam and Claire, and then picked up by a number of other people. And as Dr. Grafton said in one of his posts, we need to always remember that we are reading in translation. And that feels really difficult for me because I teach Latin and I'm teaching my kids every day that we have to be very, very careful about understanding how authors were choosing their words in their language. And Claire then brought up the issue of semantic domains. We might both use the terms mercy, but did mercy mean the same in that context as it does to us in our context? So what words mean in different contexts is huge, huge. So it feels wrong in some ways to look at these readings not in their language and try to understand them. I was really moved by the talk about metaphors. That is fascinating to me. And a lot of people brought up the issue that language is limited. And here we are trying to describe an infinite God in our human language when, first of all, we can't fully understand God, and then second of all, our language is so limited that how do we express that? So that got me thinking about language as symbolic, and as Adam was talking about the use of metaphor, and then Claire of semantic domains. So are we using symbolic language to try to create images of God? So when we get into those functional attributes, that to me feels like metaphor. So especially al-Ghazali outlines attributes of God in terms of hearing and speaking and things that involve the function of human bodies. But as he talks about speaking without voice, or Moses hearing words without words. So we're trying to understand God, again, using our limited language, but trying to express God metaphorically in terms of functions that we understand, relational functions that we understand. So that's all really interesting. So here's my thought, is creating a linguistic image in any way related to creating a visual image. So it is verboten to create visual images in Islam of God, of the Prophet Muhammad, of any living thing. I'm not sure. And of course, that was so much a part of the Christian culture, and stemming from the Greco-Roman culture. As you can see, I have some gods all around me in my classroom here, depicted in different ways, and I have shelves full of literature of stories about gods and goddesses. But I talk to my students about visual imagery that is created in poetry. And so let's get back to what we're talking about with metaphor. Isn't that a way of creating a visual imagery in words? So can visual imagery be not just visual imagery, but can visual imagery be linguistic as well? So poets, and as Dr. Grafton's saying, Arabic is a poetic language, and as came out in the discussion, its language is beautiful, it's poetic. Isn't that visual imagery that is being created through metaphor, or some other kind of imagery that's created through giving God almost human functions when we're describing the attributes? So in my Latin class, we studied the Aeneid. Maybe you know Virgil's Aeneid. And he was coming up from a tradition that was an oral tradition of passing on stories. And so I went from thinking about that to thinking about in Hinduism. Wasn't it even idolatrous to put the scriptures in writing? And so the Vedas were memorized, their scriptures were memorized, because even to put it in writing was idolatrous. So do we move from that to Islam, where the visual imagery is idolatrous, but now we've got this linguistic, this verbal imagery that is so powerful and so real that it's almost visual, it's symbolic, it's not idolatrous in Islam. In fact, you walk into a mosque and aren't the walls, I haven't been to a mosque outside of this country, but aren't the walls covered with the attributes of God, the verbal attributes of God? So instead of imagery that we would see, we see the pictures of the words. Just wanted to throw this out. I don't know if this is coherent yet or not, but wanted to throw that out. Like, in what ways is language symbolic, and at what point do we see that as that kind of symbolism as not idolatrous, whereas this kind of symbolism is idolatrous? So anyway, just some thoughts. Not quite sure how coherent that is, but really appreciate the discussion and felt very fortunate to have been in charge of al-Ghazali this week. I felt that was so grounding in looking at Tawhid and seeing the divine unity of God expressed in all of these attributes that just felt familiar and comfortable to me as a Christian. Thank you all.